Chapter 8. Where is the warm nothingness that was so comforting? Now there is nothing but harsh light and biting cold, and no possibility of ever going back. Only choice now. Go forward and face the threat, face the future. The future. The future is uncertain, and uncertainty worries me, scares me. What will happen? Will I survive? Who is the other presence that haunts me, and threatens me, and scares me, and shapes my future, and is my future, and threatens my future, and guarantees my future? I am uncertain. He, she, it scares me. Is he, she, it aware of me? Is he, she, it scared too? I am uncertain. Ace ran on, her legs aching with pain, and her panting breath cutting her lungs like a knife. Behind her, the companions pursued her relentlessly. It was only their apparent inability to organise and act as a group which had prevented them from capturing her so far. Unlike Ace, they seemed never to tire. It would only be a matter of time before they reached her. Hiding behind a clump of trees in a small gully and pausing for breath, she cursed herself for panicking and running inland away from the harbours instead of following the coast. Now she was hopelessly lost on the moors without Raphael, who had reluctantly followed her advice and run off on his own. The starless night was pitch black. What little light there was to see by came from the twin moons overhead. Far off in the distance, the lights of Kirith town twinkled and called. There would be the doctor, she thought, and beyond that the warm security of the TARDIS. A harsh, rasping sound made her jump. Crouched above her, a companion stood, its teeth bared, its claws beckoning her. It leapt down into the gully. Ace backed nervously against a tree. "My pretty," it hissed, "there is no escape. Return to the Pangistry. Fulfill your destiny." "No chance!" she cried defiantly. With a strength which surprised even her, she wrenched off a low-hanging branch from the tree and brought it crashing down on the creature's skull. It howled in pain and stumbled away. Ace took her chance and scrambled up out of the gully. She looked wildly around. The other companions had gone off in another direction. Now was her chance to get back to the doctor. A spine-chilling howl rose from the gully. Her attacker had recovered quickly and was calling to its brothers, alerting them of her whereabouts. Even now she could see them coming from the direction of the town. There was only one way to run, towards the west. As she ran and ran, the baying of the companions behind her, all sense of time and space was sublimated by her overriding instinct for survival. It was only after 10 or 15 minutes that she realised her pursuers had stopped the chase. She looked up. Before her stood the Darkfell, the place forbidden to all Kirithons. A dark wooded hill. It looked down on her impassively, seeming to offer her sanctuary. Its trees, creaking and waving in the wind, glowed with a ghostly blue phosphorescence. Ace looked back at the companions. They were cowering in groups, whimpering to each other. Some were even breaking away from the main body and heading back to the town. "They're scared of it," she suddenly realised. "Come with us," they cried. "There lies death for you. Accept the Pangistry. Join the Brotherhood." Ace picked up a handful of stones which she threw at them. "Bog off, wimps," she taunted. "Get back to your kennels." Forcing herself not to run, she quickly made her way up the hill. Behind her, the companions watched her with wary, frightened eyes. When Raphael ran off from the harbours, a few of the companions gave chase. Their hunt of him was half-hearted, however. As Ace had said, it wasn't him they were interested in. Raphael knew the moors well, and it was a simple matter to shake them off. Nevertheless, he didn't stop running or looking out for pursuers until he reached the safety of Kirith town. When he stopped, he found he was trembling. Not because of the chase, not even because of the horror he had seen in the laboratory. His whole world had been upset by the simple fact that the kindly, if stern, Lord Reptu and the harmless companions had now been shown in their true light. He had to tell someone what he had discovered and find the doctor. It was dangerous to return to his home now. Huldar would surely have been alerted of his crimes, and Raphael remembered all too clearly the Lord Procurator's earlier threat. So it was that he found himself standing at Revna's door in the middle of the night, Ace's backpack slung across his shoulder. As always, Revna was still awake, working hard at papers she had bought from Huldar's offices. When she saw Raphael, she expressed surprise, which immediately turned to concern on seeing his ashen face. She led him to a chair. "What happened?" Raphael buried his face in his hands. "It was horrible, Revna, like a giant deformed baby being torn apart." There were tears in his eyes as he told her of his discovery in the laboratory. "The Pangistri are doing terrible things, tampering with nature like that. We've got to stop them." Revna was bewildered, unable to make any sense of his words. She placed a tender hand on Raphael's shoulder. "The Pangistri are our providers, Raphael," she said softly. "Our well-being and our sustenance all come from them." "But at what expense?" He shook his head and nodded to the window. "It's not safe for me out there now. You must find the doctor for me. Tell him everything. Ace is in trouble." Revna froze. When she replied, there was a hard edge to her voice. "You are wrong, Raphael. Whatever you've seen must be for our benefit. The Pangistri mean us no harm." Then she seemed to relent. "But if it's important to you, I'll fetch the doctor from the seminary." Raphael smiled his appreciation. As for Ace, she wouldn't have got in this mess if she hadn't gone snooping around the harbours in the first place. "How did you know where we went?" "I didn't tell you." Revna's face fell. "Ace is a rogue element," she said defensively. "She's not part of our life here." Raphael pushed Revna away in disgust and stood up angrily. "You informed on us." "I did it for you, Raphael. Ace is a bad influence on you. In the past 3 days, I've lived more than you have in the past 28 years, he raged. "If that's a bad influence, then I'm all for it." "I did it for you," she repeated, tears now in her eyes. "Well, don't. You've interfered with my life ever since we were children, and I'm tired of it. I'm tired of you never questioning what's given to you, always keeping within the precious rules. I want to be with real people, not cold and efficient fawners like Tanyel and you." Revna found it an effort to keep her voice steady. "My duty is to the smooth running of Kirith and the happiness of its citizens. We must all accept our responsibilities at some time, Raphael. We can't be children forever. Can't we?" Raphael glared at her, and then threw Ace's rucksack over his shoulder and stormed out. For minutes, Revna sat silently, staring into space. She had always acted with Raphael's best interests in mind, she told herself. Ace and the doctor were harmful influences on him and on all Kirith, and they needed to be disposed of. But if Raphael was to reject her advice, that was up to him. Hard though it was to make the choice, she realised that her prime duty lay with Kirith, not with the one who had always rejected her advances. And if it was no longer possible for Revna to love with passion, then she would hate with fury. The Darkfell reminded Ace of the fairy tale woods of her childhood books, full of dark and uncertain menace. Many of the trees were dead and barren, the others had grown to enormous heights, and their spreading branches concealed the sky. The trees, and much of the vegetation, glowed with an eerie phosphorescence. Small animals skittered about, burrowing for insects in the ground or hiding in the grass at the sound of her approach. Patches of mist hung over small pools of foul-smelling water. The only sound was the wind whistling ghost-like through the trees. She could see why the companions hadn't followed her here. A sense of evil covered the place like a shroud, and there was that peculiar smell like ammonia. Was that the poison Raphael had talked about? She looked behind her and tensed. She could have sworn she saw a movement in the bushes. Cautiously she approached the spot, but there was nothing there. "This is crazy," she thought. "I'm acting like Red Riding Hood looking for the wolf." But still she could not rid herself of a vague sense of unease, a suspicion that someone was watching her. "Who's there?" she stammered. No reply. She quickened her pace. There was something there, she was sure of it. Panic set in, and she fled the unseen threat, running into branches which scratched at her face and ripped at her jacket. Reaching a clearing, she tripped over the root of a tree, twisting her ankle and crashing down to the ground. Wide-eyed with fear, she watched as dark shadows closed in on her from every side, taking advantage of her helplessness. "Well, at least I'll go down with a fight," she thought, and grabbed at a small rock, raising her arm to throw it. The creatures came closer, and she froze with horror at the sight of them. The rock dropped from her hand. They were dressed in rags and were recognisably humanoid, yet these were humans whose like she had never seen before. They seemed incomplete, pathetic mockeries of the human form. Many of them were armless or legless, dragging themselves along the ground by their arms. Others had underdeveloped limbs, like ghastly thalidomide victims, or the arms of others were so long that they trailed ape-like on the ground. Some had male faces on otherwise female bodies. One had no face at all, just a blank mound of flesh. Another woman had a third eye in the middle of her forehead, and walked hand in hand with a man whose entire body was covered in coarse hair and who had no mouth. They all muttered amongst themselves, pointing at Ace and shaking their heads. Ace winced in terror as the band of freaks surrounded her. One of them, a male whose entire body was covered in crusty sores, reached out a gnarled hand to her. She instinctively backed away in revulsion, which quickly turned to amazement and incredulity. The creature was tearing a strip of cloth off the rags he was wearing and binding her injured ankle. Despite the arthritic appearance of his hands, he was performing the task with ease and great dexterity. His companions looked on, making noises of appreciation at his skill. After he had finished binding her ankle, he bared his yellowing teeth. It was, Ace decided, his approximation of a smile. "Thank you," she said. The creature bowed his head. "I assure you, it was entirely my pleasure, young lady," he said in a voice rich with plummy vowels. "Let me help you to your feet." "You can speak!" Ace gasped in amazement as she took hold of his hand. "And why shouldn't he?" asked an imperious female voice. The crowd surrounding Ace parted to reveal the speaker. Like all the others, she was dressed in rags, but even in these she walked tall and upright, as if they were the most regal robes ever fashioned. Her blue flesh was almost totally transparent, and through it Ace could see nerves and blood vessels, which pumped and pulsed as she spoke. Her silky hair was pulled tightly back, as though deliberately to draw attention to the cruel, oozing sore on her forehead. Her scarred and mutilated face could not quite conceal her once haughty beauty. "We may look like animals and monsters, but I assure you we were once as human as you." I'm sorry. I didn't realise," Ace replied guiltily. "I am Aaron of the Unlike," said the woman. "What were you doing on the Darkfell? I thought it was forbidden to all Kirathons." "But I'm not a Kirathon." Aaron took the information in her stride. "So the Pangestri are still luring star travellers to this planet." She touched Ace's face with her cold and clammy hand and looked at her more closely. "Now I recognise you. I saw your arrival, the companion of the Doctor." "You know him?" Aaron shook her head. "I know of him. The Pangestri have waited for his coming for centuries now, here at the end of all things." Ace looked puzzled, and Aaron explained. "The universe is old, and nearing its close. Eons of expansion have exhausted its energies. Now stars are dying, and the universe itself is contracting and falling in on itself. In such circumstances, the Pangestri believe the Doctor would have to come. But why they awaited him with such eagerness, I never found out, even when I was in their service." "You worked for the Pangestri?" "They trained me to be their assistant. I worked for them at the harbours, on the breeding of the homunculus." "You were responsible for that?" accused Ace. "It was to my advantage," Aaron replied coldly. "I'm a scientist. Only by working at the harbours could I have access to all the technology that the Pangestri denied the other Kirathons." "It's disgusting." "Yes." "But why are they breeding it?" "Who knows? It's better not to ask too many awkward questions of our great benefactors," she said ironically, and indicated her face. "When I began to investigate their actions, this is what happened to me. The Pangestri are the greatest geneticists the universe has ever known," she said in reply to Ace's unspoken question. "Over the centuries, they've been using the Kirathons in their genetic experiments. The homunculus was bred from cultivated Kirathon cells. A few are taken to Kandassi, the others are experimented on at the harbours, subjected to the most hideous tortures in the name of science and curiosity. Even I could not tolerate that. She waved a hand at her colleagues. We are all the results of the Pangistris' experiments, the unlucky ones who escaped from the harbours and lived. But why hasn't anyone stood up to them? Why hasn't anyone noticed their friends disappearing? Aaron laughed bitterly. The Pangistri were once great telepaths. Even now, with their powers diminished, they can influence conditioned minds. They provide Kirith with Zavat, a marvellous source of sustenance and the base constituent of all the food eaten on Kirith. It weakens the resistance centres of the brain and makes all but the strongest minds susceptible to telepathic suggestions. She laughed bitterly. But if only the Kirithans knew what Zavat really was. Ace shuddered and felt herself wanting to retch as she recalled the food she had eaten during her stay in the seminary. Zavat is nothing more than the reconstituted remains of the victims of the Pangistris' genetic experiments. The Kirithons, if only they knew it, are eating their own kind. Dawn was breaking over Kirith town when Raphael found the doctor and Myril in the seminary library, debating their plan of action. Breathlessly, Raphael began to tell the doctor of his discovery at the harbours, but the doctor's first concern was for Ace. "What do you mean you left her?" he cried angrily. "She made me," he protested. "Said it was her they were after, not me." The doctor bit his lip to suppress his anger and concern. "You were supposed to look after her, Jamie." Raphael and Myril looked curiously at him. The doctor clenched his fists in anger. "Not Jamie, Raphael," he reminded himself. Why did he keep slipping back to his old persona? What was his second incarnation trying to tell him? He took a few deep breaths. "Things are getting too much out of control," he said. "Where might she have gone?" Raphael shrugged guiltily. The doctor sighed. Ace could probably look after herself, he supposed, even without the contents of her backpack, which Raphael was now carrying. Their first priority was to return to the harbours, and then to Kandassi. It was time to confront the Pangistri on their home ground. Myril and Raphael viewed the prospect with gloom, but reluctantly followed the doctor as he stalked out of the library. Abruptly he turned back. "Myril, is there another way out of here?" Myril indicated a door at the furthest end of the room. "Then I suggest we use that." "Why?" "Would a gang of baying overgrown weasels be a good enough reason?" "Ah, yes, I suppose so." They ran down the aisles of books and reading desks as Huldar and 4 companions burst through the main door. Caught up once more in the thrill of the chase, the companions leapt over desks and tables, overturning computers and piles of precious manuscripts in their effort to reach the doctor and his party. Raphael was the first to reach the second door and turned to see how his friends were doing. Huldar confronted the doctor, pushing him against one of the large bookshelves which lined the room. "Surrender, doctor! There is no chance of escape." "Oh, I don't know," said the doctor, as his hands reached for the bookshelf behind him. "A friend of mine once said that the pen is mightier than the sword, you know." "What are you talking about?" asked Huldar, and found out precisely what the doctor was talking about when a heavy volume hit him full square in the belly, winding him. The companions were meanwhile playing a macabre game of cat and mouse with Myril, chasing him round the long reading tables of the library, while the old man tried desperately to reason with them. Finally, he looked over to Raphael. "Raphael, if you're not too busy, I would appreciate some assistance." Raphael looked around desperately for something with which to attack the companions. Shouting out a warning to Myril, he pushed with all his strength at a bookcase, which fell clattering to the ground on top of the attacking companions. "Ah, the power of the written word," said the doctor, as he helped Myril to his feet and raced to join Raphael by the open door. And then they stopped dead as another group of companions cut off their escape, and grabbing them roughly, dragged them towards Huldar. The Lord Procurator spat in the doctor's eyes. "Think yourself lucky, doctor, that the Pangistri want you alive," he said. "If it was my decision, you would already be dead." "How did you find us here?" asked Myril. "I have my spies," smiled Huldar. As they were escorted away, Raphael glared accusingly at Revna, who had just appeared in the doorway. Tears in her eyes, she turned away.